brass bell above the door of Chateau Laurent chimed at exactly 7:43 on a humid Friday evening in August 1972, and every head in the dining room turned to watch the old man shuffle inside. His boots, scuffed leather, split along the seams, left faint dust trails across the polished marble floor. This wasn't just any restaurant in San Antonio, Texas. It was the restaurant. The kind of place where oil barons sealed deals over brandy and politicians whispered in leather booths beneath crystal chandeliers. The maître d', a thin man named Bernard with a pencil mustache, froze mid-gesture, his menu hovering in the air like a shield. The old man wore a flannel shirt patched at the elbows, denim overalls faded to the color of old newspapers, and a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better decades. His face was weathered, carved deep with lines that spoke of sun and soil and years spent outdoors. "Sir," Bernard said, his voice tight with disapproval, "I'm afraid we have a dress code." The old man didn't respond. He simply removed his hat, revealing white hair combed neatly to one side, and scanned the room with pale blue eyes that seemed to look through things rather than at them. At a corner table near the window, a little girl in a yellow sundress stood up so fast her chair scraped the floor. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old, dark curls bouncing as she waved both arms above her head. "Grandpa, before we go any further, whether you're watching this over morning coffee or winding down after a long day, we'd love to know, where in the world are you right now? And what time is it where you are? Drop a comment below. And if you're enjoying this story, hit that like button and subscribe. We've got more incredible true stories coming your way." The girl's mother, a woman in her early 30s with the same dark curls, reached out to stop her daughter. But the child was already halfway across the dining room, weaving between tables with the confidence of someone who'd never been told she didn't belong. The old man's face transformed, the hard lines softened. He knelt, slowly, joints protesting, and opened his arms just as the girl crashed into him. "You made it," she whispered into his shoulder. "Wouldn't miss it for the world, Rosie." Bernard cleared his throat. "Excuse me, but he's with us," the woman said, standing now, her voice steady but her hands trembling slightly as she smoothed her dress. "My father. We've been expecting him." A murmur rippled through the restaurant. At a nearby table, a man in a steel gray suit leaned toward his companion, a younger man with slicked back hair and a Rolex catching the light, and muttered just loud enough to carry, "They'll let anyone in these days." The older man chuckled, swirling his scotch. "Probably came straight from the fields. Bet he doesn't even know which fork to use." Rosie stiffened in her grandfather's arms. She pulled back, her small face suddenly fierce, and looked up at him with eyes that held more determination than most adults could muster. She whispered a single word. "Tell them." The old man's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air around him. A straightening of the spine, a subtle lift of the chin. He reached into the inner pocket of his worn jacket, the fabric so old it had gone soft as chamois, and pulled out a small leather case. He handed it to Rosie without a word. She carried it to the center of the dining room, holding it in both hands like an offering, and opened it beneath the chandelier's light. Inside, pinned to faded velvet, were 3 medals: the Bronze Star, the Silver Star, and centered above them both, unmistakable even to those who'd never seen one in person, the Medal of Honor. The dining room fell silent. Not the polite hush of good manners, but the stunned, breathless quiet that follows a revelation no one was prepared for. Bernard's menu slipped from his fingers and hit the floor with a sharp crack. The man in the gray suit, the one who'd made the comment about forks, went pale. His Scotch glass hovered halfway to his lips, forgotten, as his eyes fixed on the medals with an expression that looked disturbingly close to recognition. But the old man wasn't looking at him. He was looking at his granddaughter, at the pride blazing in her small face, at the way she held those medals like they were the most important things in the world. Because to her, they were. And in that moment, everyone in Chateau Laurent realized they'd made a terrible mistake. But what none of them knew, not yet, was that the medals told only half the story. The other half was still buried in classified files, in memories too painful to speak aloud, and in the conscience of the man in the gray suit, whose hand had just started to shake. The silence stretched like a wire pulled taut, ready to snap. Bernard moved first, his face flushing crimson as he bent to retrieve the fallen menu, his hands fumbling with a grace that had completely abandoned him. The old man, whose name, whispered now between tables, was Frank Dawson, remained standing in the center of the room, one weathered hand resting gently on his granddaughter's shoulder. "Mr. Dawson," Bernard stammered, his voice stripped of its earlier condescension. "Please allow me to escort you to your table, our finest booth. Compliments of the house, naturally." Frank shook his head slowly. "Already got a table. My daughter made a reservation 3 weeks ago." The reproach in those simple words landed harder than any accusation could have. Rosie carefully closed the medal case and handed it back to her grandfather, who tucked it away in his jacket pocket with the practiced motion of someone who'd carried those honors for so long they'd become part of him. Not displayed, not advertised, just there. As Frank walked toward the corner table where his daughter waited, something remarkable happened. Diners stood, not all at once, and not with any coordination, but one by one. Chairs scraping back, napkins set down, hands moving to hearts in unconscious salute. An elderly woman near the kitchen entrance had tears streaming down her powdered cheeks. A young waiter, barely 20, stood frozen with a tray of desserts balanced on his palm, his mouth slightly open. But the man in the gray suit remained seated, his face now ash-white, his eyes tracking Frank's movement with the intensity of someone watching a ghost materialize from their past. His younger companion leaned in. "Dad, what's wrong? You look like you've seen—" "Shut up, Robert." The words came out harsh, strangled. Frank settled into the booth across from his daughter, Sarah, who reached across the table to squeeze his hand. Her eyes were wet, but her smile was fierce. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "Show them." Rosie asked. "She's 8 years old. She doesn't understand." "She understands what matters." Frank's voice was soft, but carried the weight of absolute certainty. That her grandpa keeps his word. That he shows up when he says he will. That's more important than what anyone in this room thinks of my boots. Rosie, seated beside her mother, reached for the basket of bread in the center of the table. She tore off a piece and handed it to Frank first. A small gesture, unconscious, the way children honor the people they love. Frank accepted it, broke it in half, and gave her back the larger portion. The exchange lasted 3 seconds, but Sarah felt her throat tighten watching it. "This is why I fought to bring him here," she thought. Not to prove anything to these people. To give Rosie this memory. Across the dining room, the man in the gray suit, whose name was William Carver, though Frank hadn't recognized him yet, drained his scotch in a single swallow and signaled the waiter for another. His hand shook badly enough that the empty glass rattled against the table. "Dad." Robert's voice dropped to a whisper. "What's going on?" William didn't answer. He was staring at Frank with an expression that cycled between horror, shame, and something darker, a desperate calculation happening behind his eyes. Because William Carver knew exactly who Frank Dawson was. He'd known the moment those medals came out. And more than that, he knew what Frank didn't. That their lives were connected by a single night in a jungle 24 years ago. A night that had saved William's life and cost others theirs. A night that had earned Frank those medals and left scars on both men that no amount of time or distance could heal. William had spent 2 decades building a fortune in oil, constructing a reputation, becoming untouchable in San Antonio's business circles. He'd buried that jungle night so deep, he'd almost convinced himself it never happened. But here, in Chateau Laurent on a humid August evening in 1972, the past had just walked through the door in scuffed boots and patched overalls, and William Carver, for all his wealth and power, had never felt more exposed. The waiter approached Frank's table, his earlier professional detachment replaced by something bordering on reverence. "Sir, what can I get for you this evening?" Frank studied the menu, leather-bound, embossed in gold, listing dishes in French with English translations beneath. The prices weren't printed, that kind of place. "What's good here?" he asked simply. "Everything, sir. But may I recommend the filet mignon? It's our signature." Frank nodded. "That'll do. Medium rare." "Excellent choice. And to drink?" "Water's fine." After the waiter left, Rosie leaned across the table, her voice conspiratorial. "Grandpa, do you really not care what those people think?" Frank considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I care about what's true, Rosie girl, and what's true is this. I've eaten in mess halls and foxholes and around campfires in places you'll never have to see. Food tastes the same whether you eat it off china or a tin plate. But who you eat it with, that's what matters." Rosie absorbed this wisdom with the gravity of the young, then grinned. "Mom says you used to make the best scrambled eggs in the whole army." "Still do." Sarah laughed, the tension finally breaking. "He made them with hot sauce and cheese. The other soldiers would trade their desserts for a plate." Somebody had to keep morale up. It was such a small thing, this exchange. A family sharing memories over bread, waiting for their meal. But in that moment, in that overpriced restaurant where they'd been made to feel small, they reclaimed something essential. Dignity. Not the kind bestowed by medals or money, but the kind that comes from knowing who you are and refusing to apologize for it. Across the room, William Carver pushed back from his table and stood abruptly. "We're leaving," he announced to Robert. "But we haven't finished. Now." But as William turned toward the exit, his path took him directly past Frank's table. And that's when Frank looked up. Their eyes met. And in that single, terrible moment of recognition, 24 years collapsed into nothing. Frank's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. The recognition didn't come all at once. It arrived in fragments, pieces of a face assembling themselves from memory like a puzzle worked in reverse. The eyes first, then the shape of the jaw, the way the man held his shoulders, drawn up tight like someone bracing for impact. "Carver," Frank said quietly. The name landed between them like a stone dropped into still water. William Carver froze. His son Robert, standing beside him, looked from his father to the old man in the booth, confusion written across his features. Around them, the restaurant had resumed its normal rhythm. Silverware clinking, quiet conversation, the muted jazz from hidden speakers. But in the space between these two men, time had stopped. "You remember," William said, not a question. "I remember." Sarah felt her daughter tense beside her, felt the shift in the air that children sense before adults acknowledge. She reached for Rosie's hand under the table. William swallowed hard. His carefully constructed composure, the armor of expensive suits and calculated confidence, cracked visibly. When I saw you come in, I didn't realize. You made comments about my boots. Frank's voice held no anger, just statement of fact. About which fork I'd use. The words hung there, an accusation made more damning by its gentleness. Robert looked at his father with dawning horror. Dad, you didn't. But William wasn't looking at his son. He was looking at Frank with an expression that bordered on desperation. The face of a man watching his carefully constructed world begin to crumble. Lieutenant, William said, using the old rank. I need to. Can we speak privately? Anything you need to say, you can say here. Frank set down his fork with deliberate care. My family knows who I am. They know what I did. No secrets at this table. The weight of that statement pressed down on William like a physical force. He glanced around the restaurant, aware now of the eyes watching, the curiosity rippling outward from this confrontation. You saved my life, William said finally, the words torn from somewhere deep. September 9th, 1948. Firebase Delta, 3 kilometers south of... I remember the date, Frank interrupted. Remember the place. Remember everything about that night. Firebase Delta, September 9th, 1948. The memory came unwanted, vivid as yesterday. The smell of wet earth and cordite. The way the jungle sounds had gone suddenly, terribly silent just before the attack came. Frank had been a lieutenant then, 26 years old, commanding a platoon of boys barely old enough to shave. Private William Carver had been one of them, 18 years old, fresh from basic training, still writing letters home to his mother every Sunday. The ambush had come at 0300 hours. Mortars first, then small arms fire from 3 sides, a coordinated assault designed to overwhelm and destroy. In the chaos and darkness, with half his platoon already down, Frank had made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He'd called in artillery danger close. The technical term meant firing support so near your own position that you risked killing your own men. The practical reality was simpler and more terrible. Frank had gambled that the shells would kill more of the enemy than his own soldiers. He'd been right. Barely. The barrage had broken the attack, driven back the assault, saved 15 men, including Private Carver. But 3 soldiers, boys Frank had known, had trained, had promised to bring home, had died in that artillery strike. Friendly fire. The medals had come later. The official report praised his exceptional courage under fire and tactical brilliance in the face of overwhelming odds. The Medal of Honor citation never mentioned the 3 graves Frank visited every year on their birthdays, never spoke of the names he whispered in the dark when sleep wouldn't come. Henderson, Martinez, O'Brien. 24 years later, Frank could still see their faces clearly. You made a choice that night, William continued, his voice barely above a whisper now. A choice that let me come home. Let me build a life. Have a family. He gestured vaguely at Robert. I owe you everything. You don't owe me anything. Frank's tone was gentle but firm. I was doing my job. You would have done the same. No. William shook his head sharply. I wouldn't have. I was terrified. I froze. You and Sergeant Palmer had to physically drag me to the extraction point. I was dead weight. And you still... His voice cracked. You still carried me out. Rosie looked up at her grandfather with new eyes, trying to reconcile this story with the man who taught her to fish, who made her pancakes shaped like stars, who always remembered to cut the crusts off her sandwiches. Sarah squeezed her daughter's hand tighter. Frank met William's gaze steadily. That was a long time ago, Carver. Different war, different men. But you're still him, William said. Still that lieutenant who valued every life in his platoon, who made the hard calls and lived with the weight of them. He paused, something shifting in his expression. While I became, what? A man who mocks an old soldier for his clothes? The shame in William's voice was raw, unfiltered. Robert touched his father's arm. Dad, maybe we should... No. William straightened, seeming to come to some internal decision. Lieutenant Dawson saved my life in that jungle. The least I can do is face him honestly now. He reached into his jacket, a gesture that mirrored Frank's earlier motion, and pulled out a business card. He set it on the table beside Frank's water glass. I own 3 oil companies now, 47 wells across Texas and Louisiana. I'm worth more money than I know what to do with. William's laugh was bitter. And tonight, I walked into this restaurant and judged a better man than I'll ever be based on the condition of his boots. Frank looked at the business card, but didn't touch it. I don't want your money, Carver. I'm not offering charity. William's voice gained strength. I'm offering a debt repaid. Those medals, they're not just decoration. They represent sacrifice. And I know better than anyone that your sacrifice saved men who went on to live full lives, including me. He gestured around the restaurant. This place, these people, they saw your clothes and made assumptions. I made assumptions, but I know the truth, and I'm asking for the chance to make it right. The question that had been building since the medals appeared finally crystallized into something clear and urgent. What would William Carver do with his second chance at honoring the man who'd given him his first chance at life? And more importantly, could an old soldier who'd spent decades carrying the weight of impossible choices finally accept that he'd done enough? The dinner arrived in the careful silence that followed William's words. The waiter, a different one this time, older, with gray at his temples, set Frank's steak down with a reverence usually reserved for religious ceremony. Medium rare, exactly as ordered, with roasted vegetables arranged like a still life and a pat of herb butter slowly melting across the meat's surface. Sir, the waiter said quietly, meeting Frank's eyes. My brother served in Korea. He didn't make it home. What you did, what all of you did, it matters. Frank nodded once, a simple acknowledgement between men who understood certain truths without elaboration. William remained standing beside the booth, his business card still untouched on the white tablecloth. Robert had backed away slightly, giving his father space, but his eyes stayed fixed on the old man with the patched overalls who had somehow brought his father to the edge of tears in a crowded restaurant. Sit down, Carver, Frank said finally, gesturing to the empty space beside Sarah. I don't want to intrude on your family dinner. You're already intruding. Might as well make it official. The dry humor in Frank's voice seemed to unlock something in William. He slid into the booth, his expensive suit suddenly looking ridiculous next to Frank's worn flannel. Robert hesitated, then joined them, pulling a chair from a nearby table. Rosie studied William with the unfiltered directness of childhood. Are you really the one Grandpa saved? William's composure wavered. Yes. Were you scared? Rosie, Sarah cautioned, but Frank held up a hand. It's all right. He looked at William. Answer her. William met the child's eyes. I was more scared than I've ever been in my life, before or since. But Grandpa saved you. He did. And 2 other men, Sergeant Palmer and Corporal Chen, they saved me too. Your grandfather led us through 2 miles of jungle in the dark, carrying wounded men, while the enemy was still hunting us. William's voice grew quieter. Sergeant Palmer didn't make it to the extraction point. Neither did Chen. They gave their lives so the rest of us could reach the helicopters. Rosie absorbed this information with solemn attention. Then she reached across the table and patted William's hand with the unconscious compassion that children sometimes access more easily than adults. I'm sorry about your friends. William's eyes reddened. Thank you. Frank cut into his steak, the knife sliding through the meat with the ease that comes from proper preparation. He took a bite, chewed thoughtfully, then nodded with quiet approval. Good beef. The mundane observation somehow broke the remaining tension. Sarah laughed, short, relieved, and Rosie giggled. Even William managed a small smile. So, Frank said, setting down his fork and giving William his full attention. 24 years. What have you been doing besides getting rich and forgetting where you came from? The question could have been cruel. Instead, it landed with the gentle precision of a surgeon's scalpel, cutting straight to the wound that needed cleaning. William flinched, but didn't look away. Building a business, raising a family, trying to be worthy of the second chance you gave me. Trying or succeeding? I thought I was succeeding. William glanced at his son. Robert's a good man. My wife Emily, she's been the best part of my life. We've given to charities, supported veterans programs, tried to give back to the community. But tonight you mocked an old man for his clothes. William nodded slowly. Tonight I forgot the most important lesson you taught me in that jungle. What lesson was that? That a man's worth has nothing to do with his uniform, his rank, or how clean his boots are. It's about what he does when everything's falling apart, and there's no one watching to give him credit. Frank studied William for a long moment, his pale blue eyes seeming to look past the expensive suit, the Rolex, the carefully styled hair, down to whatever core of character remained from that terrified 18-year-old private. You remember Henderson? Frank asked quietly. William's face went pale. Yes. Tell me about him. The request was unexpected, and for a moment, William seemed unable to speak. Robert leaned forward, sensing this was important, but not understanding why. Danny Henderson, William said finally. From Michigan. He was 20 years old, engaged to a girl named Patricia. He showed me her photograph so many times I had it memorized. Her smile, the way she wore her hair. William's voice thickened. He died in the artillery strike, killed by our own shells. What else? Frank's tone remained gentle but insistent. He gave me his chocolate ration the night before the attack. Said I looked like I needed it more than he did. He was always doing things like that, small kindnesses that made life bearable. William paused. When the shelling started, he threw himself on top of me, used his own body as a shield. By the time I crawled out from under him, he was already gone. The restaurant noise seemed to fade into background static. Sarah held Rosie close, and Robert stared at his father with an expression somewhere between shock and newfound respect. You never told me, Robert whispered. I never told anyone. William looked at Frank. How could I? How could I explain that I'm alive because Danny Henderson used his last seconds to save me? That 3 men died so I could go home? You carry it, Frank said simply. Same as I do. Same as everyone who came back carries the ones who didn't. You honor them by living well, by being someone worthy of their sacrifice. But I mocked you tonight. I proved I'm not. You proved you're human, Frank interrupted. You made a mistake. Now you've got a choice. Let that mistake define you, or let it teach you something. The wisdom in those words settled over the table like a benediction. William pulled out a handkerchief, monogrammed, expensive, and wiped his eyes without shame. Lieutenant, I meant what I said. I want to make this right. Not just for you, but for Henderson, Palmer, Chen, all of them. Frank picked up the business card, studied it briefly, then tucked it into his shirt pocket. I'll think about it. It wasn't acceptance, but it wasn't rejection either. It was something more complicated and more honest. The acknowledgement that some debts can't be repaid with money, but that the gesture of trying still matters. The meal continued with a strange new ease. William and Robert stayed, and somehow the conversation shifted from war stories to simpler things. Rosie's love of horses, Sarah's work as a teacher, Robert's recent graduation from law school. William ordered dessert for the entire table, and when it arrived, chocolate cake with real whipped cream, Rosie's delight was so pure, it made even Frank smile. But beneath the surface of normal conversation, something profound had shifted. Two men, separated by decades and circumstances, had found their way back to a truth they'd both been avoiding: that survival carries its own weight, and that weight becomes bearable only when shared. As the evening wound down and families began leaving the restaurant, Frank noticed something remarkable. People stopped at their table, not to gawk or intrude, but to shake his hand, to say thank you, to acknowledge what those medals represented. An elderly black man with kind eyes paused beside them. My son's in Vietnam right now. I pray every night that he has a commander like you. A young couple, barely older than Robert, stopped to thank him simply for his service. Even Bernard, the maître d', who'd tried to turn Frank away at the door, approached with genuine humility. Sir, your meal tonight is on the house, and I owe you an apology. Frank accepted both with grace. But as the clock approached 10 and Sarah began gathering her things, preparing to leave, one question remained unresolved. What exactly would William Carver do to make amends for his mockery? And would it be enough to quiet the ghosts both men still carried from that September night in 1948? The parking lot of Chateau Laurent smelled of rain-soaked asphalt and honeysuckle blooming wild along the fence line. Frank walked slowly, his joints stiff after sitting for nearly 3 hours, while Rosie skipped ahead beneath the amber glow of streetlights. Sarah walked beside her father, her arm linked through his, providing support he wouldn't ask for, but accepted gratefully. Behind them, William and Robert emerged from the restaurant's entrance. "Lieutenant Dawson," William called. "Please, just one more moment." Frank stopped, turned. In the parking lot's harsh light, William looked older than he had inside, the lines around his eyes deeper, the gray at his temples more pronounced. The veneer of wealth couldn't quite mask the exhaustion of a man carrying secrets too heavy for one lifetime. "I meant what I said in there," William continued, walking closer. "About making things right. I've been thinking about how to do that properly. Carver, I already told you, I'm not talking about charity." William's voice carried a new urgency. "I'm talking about purpose, about giving meaning to the sacrifice those men made." Robert had caught up to his father now, and something in his expression suggested they'd been discussing this outside. Sarah pulled Rosie back slightly, creating space for the men to talk, but close enough to hear. "What are you proposing?" Frank asked. William reached into his jacket and pulled out a checkbook, leather-bound, embossed with gold initials, but he didn't open it. Instead, he held it in both hands like an offering being considered and found insufficient. "Money's too easy," William said. Too impersonal. Henderson, Palmer, Chen, they deserve better than a check written to ease my conscience. He paused, choosing his words carefully. What if we built something? Something lasting? Built what? A foundation for veterans and their families, specifically for the ones who fall through the cracks, the ones who need help with medical bills, housing, education, job training, the ones who saved their brothers in arms but can't seem to save themselves. The idea hung in the humid Texas air, taking shape between them. Frank remained silent, his weathered face unreadable in the amber light. Rosie had gone still beside her mother, sensing this was important even if she couldn't fully understand why. I've done preliminary research, William continued, gaining momentum now. There are gaps in the VA system, huge gaps. Men who served honorably, but don't qualify for certain benefits because of discharge dates or service classifications. Families who can't afford to bury their fathers with the dignity they deserve. Kids like Rosie who'll never know their grandfathers because those men came home broken and couldn't find their way back. Robert spoke up for the first time. We could call it the Henderson Palmer Chen Foundation, named for the men who gave everything. The suggestion clearly surprised Frank. He studied Robert with new interest. This young man who'd witnessed his father's shame and somehow chosen to help build something from it, rather than simply look away. You'd do that? Frank asked William. Put their names first? Not yours? Their names are the only ones that matter. William's voice was firm. This wouldn't be about me or my guilt. It would be about honoring men who deserved to come home and didn't, and making sure the men who did come home get the support they were promised. Sarah cleared her throat softly. May I say something? All eyes turned to her. I teach at a public school in Houston, she said. 3rd grade. And every year I have at least 3 or 4 students whose fathers served in Vietnam. Some came back, some didn't. The ones who did, she paused, her voice catching. The ones who did are struggling, nightmares, drinking, anger they can't control, and their families are drowning trying to help them, but there's nowhere to turn. No one to ask, no safety net. She looked at her father. Dad carried his war silently for 24 years. He never asked for help, never complained, never let his pain become our burden. But I watched it eat at him. I watched him wake up screaming. I watched him stand in the shower for an hour just to stop shaking. Her eyes were wet now. If this foundation could help even one family avoid what we went through, if it could help one veteran feel like his service mattered, then it's worth building. The rawness of her confession seemed to crack something open in the night. Frank reached out and took his daughter's hand, squeezing once. Acknowledgement, gratitude, love compressed into a single gesture. It's a good idea, Carver, Frank said finally. A worthy one, but I've got a condition. Name it. I don't want my name on it. Not the building, not the letterhead, not the publicity materials. This isn't about me. William started to protest, but Frank held up a hand. Those medals in my pocket, they don't belong to me. They belong to every man who served, every family that waited, every mother who got a telegram she never wanted to read. If we're going to do this, we do it for them. All of them. Not for one old soldier who happened to survive. The humility in Frank's words was staggering. Here was a man with the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration, asking to be left out of the story entirely. William nodded slowly. I understand. But Lieutenant, we'll need your input, your wisdom. You know what these men need better than any bureaucrat or administrator ever could. I can do that. And Robert added, his voice tentative but determined. We'd like you to serve on the board, help us make decisions, keep us honest. Frank looked at the young man, at the hope in his eyes, the genuine desire to do something meaningful, and felt something shift in his chest. A weight he'd been carrying since 1948, just slightly lighter, not gone, never gone, but bearable. They talked for another 30 minutes in that parking lot, working out preliminary details. William would provide the initial funding, $2 million to start, with a commitment to match donations dollar for the first 5 years. Robert would handle the legal incorporation and nonprofit paperwork. Sarah would help design educational programs for veterans' children, and Frank would do what he'd always done: show up when needed, speak truth when required, and ensure that the mission stayed pure. As they finally prepared to part ways, Rosie tugged on William's sleeve. Mr. Carver? He knelt down to her level. Yes, sweetheart. Are you and Grandpa friends now? The question was impossibly complex and beautifully simple at the same time. William glanced at Frank, who was watching with an expression somewhere between amusement and curiosity. I don't know if your grandfather and I will ever be friends, William said honestly, but we're something else, something important. We're bound by the men we both loved and lost, and that's a connection that can't be broken. Rosie considered this with the seriousness it deserved, then nodded. That's good. She reached out and hugged William, quick, spontaneous, the way children hug without calculation or expectation of return. William closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, there were tears running down his cheeks. Thank you, he whispered. But as Sarah's car pulled out of the parking lot, Frank sitting beside her with Rosie asleep in the back seat, none of them could have known that the foundation they'd just agreed to build would face its first real test far sooner than expected, or that the ghosts of Firebase Delta were about to demand one final accounting. 3 days after the dinner at Chateau Laurent, Frank stood in his small workshop behind the house he'd built with his own hands in 1953. The smell of sawdust and mineral oil filled the air, familiar grounding scents that had steadied him through decades of nightmares and memories that wouldn't stay buried. He was sanding a wooden horse he'd been carving for Rosie's birthday, the rhythmic motion of his hands keeping time with thoughts too heavy for words. The phone rang inside the house. Frank set down the sandpaper, wiped his hands on his overalls, and walked through the back door into the kitchen, where the avocado green rotary phone hung on the wall. He'd installed it himself last year after Sarah insisted he needed a way to reach help if something happened. Dawson, he answered. Lieutenant, it's William Carver. The voice on the other end was tight with barely controlled emotion. We have a problem. Frank's grip tightened on the receiver. What kind of problem? I received a call this morning from a reporter at the San Antonio Express. Someone leaked the story about what happened at the restaurant. About you, about me, about Firebase Delta. William paused. They're running it tomorrow. Front page. The news settled over Frank like cold water. He pulled out a kitchen chair and sat down slowly. How much do they know? Everything. The medals, the ambush, Henderson, Palmer, Chen. They even have the casualty reports from that night. William's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. They know about the friendly fire. There it was. The truth Frank had carried for 24 years, documented in military files, but never spoken aloud in civilian life. The 3 men who died from American artillery shells called in by their own lieutenant to save the rest of the platoon. Who leaked it? Frank asked. I don't know. But Lieutenant, there's more. The reporter wants to interview you, and there's someone else who contacted them. Someone claiming to be Patricia Henderson. Danny Henderson's fiancée? Frank felt his chest tighten. Patricia Henderson. The woman in the photograph Danny had shown him dozens of times. The woman who'd received a telegram in the fall of 1948, telling her the man she loved wasn't coming home. What does she want? To know the truth about how Danny died. William's voice cracked. She's been living for 24 years thinking he was killed by enemy fire. Now she's found out it was our own artillery, and she wants answers. Frank closed his eyes, seeing Danny Henderson's face as clearly as if he were standing in the room. Young, eager, kind. The boy who'd given up his chocolate ration. The boy who'd used his body as a shield. When does she want to talk? Tomorrow afternoon, 2 o'clock, at my office downtown. William hesitated. Lieutenant, you don't have to do this. I can handle it. I can take responsibility. After all, I'm the one who... You were a private following orders, Frank interrupted. I made the call. I live with the consequences. If Mrs. Henderson wants answers, she deserves them from me. The following afternoon arrived with the weight of inevitability. Sarah had driven up from Houston that morning after Frank called to tell her what was happening. She stood in his bedroom now, watching him button a shirt he'd worn to exactly 3 events in the past decade. Her wedding, Rosie's baptism, and the funeral of a fellow veteran who'd drunk himself to death. You don't have to wear a tie, Sarah said softly. Yes, I do. Mrs. Henderson deserves that respect. His hands trembled slightly as he worked the knot. A simple 4-in-hand that he'd learned in basic training 30 years ago. Sarah stepped forward and gently took over, her fingers deft and sure. Dad, whatever happens today, whatever she says, you need to remember that you saved 15 men that night. 15 men who came home to their families. And 3 men didn't. You carried that weight for 24 years. You've paid your dues. Frank met his daughter's eyes in the mirror. Some debts don't get paid off, honey. They just get carried. William's office occupied the top floor of a steel and glass building in downtown San Antonio. The receptionist, an efficient woman in her 40s, recognized Frank immediately and ushered him past the waiting area into a corner conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. William stood by the window, his back to the door. He turned when Frank entered, and the strain of the past 3 days showed clearly in his face. The dark circles under his eyes, the new lines bracketing his mouth. She's not here yet, William said. But the reporter is. He's waiting in my office. I thought we should talk first. Nothing to talk about. We tell the truth. The truth is going to destroy both our reputations. Frank shook his head slowly. Our reputations don't matter, Carver. What matters is giving Mrs. Henderson peace. Letting her know her fiancé died a hero. Because he did. Whatever else happened that night, Danny Henderson's last act was to save your life. Before William could respond, the receptionist appeared in the doorway. Mr. Carver, Mrs. Henderson has arrived. Send her in. Patricia Henderson walked into the conference room, and Frank felt time collapse. She was 43 years old now, the same age Danny would have been had he lived. But she carried herself with the brittle dignity of someone who'd learned to live with grief as a constant companion. Her hair, once dark in the photograph Danny had shown him, was now streaked with gray. She wore a simple blue dress and carried a purse clutched tightly in both hands. Her eyes, brown, intelligent, filled with decades of unanswered questions, locked onto Frank's face. Lieutenant Dawson. Ma'am. Frank stood, offering his hand. She didn't take it. Instead, she reached into her purse and pulled out a photograph, worn at the edges, faded with time. She set it on the conference table. It was Danny Henderson in his uniform, smiling at the camera with the unguarded joy of a young man who believed he had his whole life ahead of him. That was taken 2 weeks before he shipped out, Patricia said. Her voice was steady but carried an undertone of carefully controlled emotion. He promised me he'd come home. He promised we'd get married, have children, grow old together. She paused. Instead, I got a telegram and a folded flag. Frank looked at the photograph, at the face he'd seen in his nightmares for 24 years. Mrs. Henderson, I'm sorry. More sorry than words can express. I don't want your apologies, Lieutenant. I want the truth. All of it. She pulled out a chair and sat down, her posture rigid with determination. How did my Danny die? The question hung in the air between them, simple in construction, devastating in implication. And Frank Dawson, who'd earned the Medal of Honor for his actions that night, who'd carried the weight of command and consequence for nearly a quarter century, sat down across from the woman whose life he'd irrevocably changed and began to tell her everything. Frank spoke for 40 minutes without interruption. He told Patricia Henderson about Firebase Delta, the way the jungle had pressed close on all sides, thick and humid and alive with threats they couldn't see. He described the men under his command, boys really, most of them younger than 25. He told her how Danny had become the heart of the platoon, the one who kept spirits up with terrible jokes and generous gestures, the one everyone turned to when the fear got too heavy. Patricia sat motionless, her hands folded on the table beside Danny's photograph, her eyes never leaving Frank's face. The attack came at 0300 hours, Frank continued, his voice steady but soft. We'd had intelligence suggesting enemy movement in the area, but nothing concrete. I'd posted sentries, but they hit us from 3 directions simultaneously. Mortars first, then small arms fire. In the first 30 seconds, we lost 6 men. He described the chaos, the way sound became meaningless in combat. Everything reduced to muzzle flashes and screaming, and the wet, terrible sounds of bullets finding flesh. He told her how Danny Henderson had pulled 2 wounded soldiers into cover, how he'd returned fire even as shrapnel from a mortar round opened up his shoulder, how he'd refused to stop fighting even when blood soaked through his uniform. We were pinned down, Frank said. No way forward, no way back. The enemy had us surrounded, and they were closing in. I had 15 seconds to make a decision that would determine who lived and who died. William, standing by the window, had gone pale. He'd heard the official version of this story, but never like this, never stripped down to the raw, unvarnished truth. I called in artillery, Frank said. Danger close. That means firing support so near your own position that you risk hitting your own men. The coordinates I gave put the impact zone within 50 yards of our location. Patricia's composure cracked for the first time. Her hands tightened on each other, knuckles going white. You called artillery on your own men? Yes, ma'am. Why? Because if I didn't, we all died. Every single one of us. Frank's voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. The enemy had overwhelming numbers and superior position. We had minutes, maybe seconds, before they overran us completely. The artillery was our only chance. He paused, gathering himself for the hardest part. When the shells came in, they broke the enemy assault, saved 15 lives. But 3 of our own men died in that barrage. Sergeant Palmer, Corporal Chen, and Private Danny Henderson. The name hung in the air like an accusation. Patricia closed her eyes, When she opened them again, tears ran down her cheeks, but her voice remained steady. Where was he when the shells hit? Frank felt his throat tighten. He was covering Private Carver. He gestured toward William. Danny knew the artillery was coming. I'd called out the warning, told everyone to get to cover. But Carver had been hit, shrapnel in the leg, couldn't move fast enough. Danny threw himself on top of Carver and held him down, used his own body as a shield. William made a sound like a wounded animal. He turned away from the window, his shoulders shaking. Danny Henderson saved William Carver's life, Frank continued. Gave his own life to do it. That's not in the official report. The report just lists him as killed by friendly fire. But that's the truth, Mrs. Henderson. Your fiancé died a hero. He died protecting a brother in arms. He died doing exactly what he'd been trained to do, putting others before himself. Patricia stared at the photograph on the table, tears falling freely now. Did he suffer? The question every soldier dreads, the one Frank had answered in countless letters over the years, always with the same careful lie. No, it was instantaneous. He felt no pain. But he'd promised Patricia Henderson the truth. All of it. I don't know, Frank said quietly. I'd like to tell you it was quick, that he didn't feel anything. But I don't know. What I do know is that his last conscious act was to save another man's life. And when we reached him after the barrage stopped, when I held him in my arms while we waited for the medic, Frank's voice broke. He smiled. Just for a second, like he knew he'd done something that mattered. The conference room fell silent except for the sound of Patricia Henderson's quiet weeping. William crossed the room and knelt beside her chair. His face was streaked with tears, his composure completely abandoned. Mrs. Henderson, he said, his voice raw. I'm William Carver. I was the private your fiancé saved. I was the one Danny died protecting. Patricia looked at him, seeing him truly for the first time. I've lived 24 years with that knowledge, William continued. 24 years knowing I'm alive because Danny Henderson used his last moments to shield me. I built a life, had a family, made money, but not a single day has passed when I haven't thought about him, when I haven't wished it had been me instead. Then why? Patricia's voice was fierce now, edged with anger. Why did you mock Lieutenant Dawson 3 nights ago? Why did you disrespect the man who called in the strike that killed my Danny, when that same man saved your life? The question cut to the bone. William had no defense, no explanation that wouldn't sound like an excuse, so he simply told the truth. Because I'm a coward. Because I've spent 24 years running from that night instead of honoring it. Because it was easier to bury the memory and pretend I'd earned my success through my own merit than to face the fact that I'm only alive because better men died in my place. He looked up at Frank. Lieutenant Dawson made an impossible choice that night, a choice I couldn't have made, a choice that haunts him every day, even though it was the right one. The only one. And instead of thanking him, instead of honoring that sacrifice, I mocked him for his clothes. Patricia studied William for a long moment, then turned back to Frank. Do you regret calling in the artillery? Frank met her eyes without flinching. Every single day. But I'd make the same call again if I had to. Because 15 men came home to their families. 15 men got to live full lives, have children, grow old. That has to count for something. It does. Patricia reached out and touched the photograph of Danny, her fingers tracing the outline of his face. But Lieutenant, you need to understand something. Danny knew what he was signing up for. He wasn't naive. He knew soldiers die. And if you'd asked him, if you'd given him the choice between saving himself or saving his brothers, he would have chosen them every time. She looked at William. You. He would have chosen you. Not because you deserved it or earned it, but because that's who Danny was. He believed every life mattered. He believed in leaving the world better than he found it. Patricia stood up, collecting herself with visible effort. She picked up Danny's photograph and held it against her chest. I came here angry. I came here wanting someone to blame for 24 years of loneliness. But Lieutenant Dawson, you didn't take Danny from me. The war did. And you gave his death meaning by saving those 15 men, by carrying the weight of that decision all these years. She turned to William. And you have a debt to pay. Not to me, not to Danny, but to the world. You need to live a life worthy of his sacrifice. You need to be the man he believed you could be when he covered you with his own body. William nodded, unable to speak. Patricia walked to the door, then paused and looked back. Lieutenant Dawson, thank you for telling me the truth. It doesn't make the grief easier, but it gives me something I haven't had in 24 years. What's that, ma'am? Peace. Knowing that Danny died doing exactly what he would have wanted. Saving a life. Being a hero. She smiled through her tears. That's who he was. And now, finally, I can remember him that way. She left the conference room, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. Frank and William sat in the aftermath of her words. Two men bound by guilt and grace, by death and survival, by the impossible weight of choices made in darkness. Outside the window, San Antonio stretched out beneath a cloudless Texas sky. And somewhere in that city, 15 families went about their ordinary lives, cooking dinner, helping children with homework, planning weekend trips, completely unaware that they existed because of an impossible choice made by a 26-year-old lieutenant 24 years ago. The reporter from the San Antonio Express never got his interview. William Carver called him and said the story was off the record, that there would be no exposé, no front-page scandal. Instead, there would be something better. The Henderson Palmer Chen Foundation, officially launched 6 weeks later, with Patricia Henderson cutting the ribbon and Frank Dawson standing quietly in the back row, refusing to take credit or make speeches. The foundation would go on to help thousands of veterans over the next 4 decades. But that's another story. This one ends here, in a conference room overlooking San Antonio, where 3 people found a way to transform grief into grace, and where the ghosts of Firebase Delta finally, mercifully, allowed themselves to rest. 2 years passed like water through open fingers. The Henderson Palmer Chen Foundation opened its doors in a modest building on the east side of San Antonio in the spring of 1974. The grand opening drew veterans from 3 wars, families who'd lost sons and fathers, and politicians who came to shake hands and make promises they'd mostly forget by the following week. But Frank Dawson remembered everything. He stood in the lobby on that opening day, watching Patricia Henderson unveil a bronze plaque bearing the names of the 3 men who'd given the foundation its purpose. The plaque included photographs: Danny Henderson's familiar smile, Sergeant Palmer's steady gaze, Corporal Chen's gentle eyes. Below their images, a simple inscription: "Greater love has no man than this, that he lay down his life for his friends." Frank's hands trembled as he read those words, but Rosie, now 10 years old, tall and serious and remarkably perceptive, took his hand and squeezed. "They'd be proud, Grandpa." "I hope so, Rosie girl." The foundation's work began quietly but purposefully. William Carver had kept his promise. funding the operation with a portion of his oil company's profits and personally overseeing the financial operations. Robert Carver, now a practicing attorney, provided legal services pro bono and sat on the board alongside Frank, Patricia Henderson, and 3 other veterans whose judgment William trusted. Sarah designed educational programs for veterans' children, scholarships, tutoring services, mentorship opportunities. Within the first year, 17 kids received full college funding. Within 3 years, that number grew to over 100. But the Foundation's most important work happened in the quiet moments no one photographed or publicized. The late-night phone calls from veterans on the edge of despair. The emergency grants that kept families housed and fed. The job training programs that gave broken men a sense of purpose again. Frank volunteered 3 days a week, sitting in a small office on the 2nd floor where veterans could come talk without judgment or agenda. He didn't offer therapy, he wasn't trained for that. But he offered something perhaps more valuable. The presence of someone who understood, who'd carried the same weight, who knew that some wounds never fully heal but can be made bearable through witness and companionship. On a Thursday afternoon in October 1975, a young man walked into Frank's office. He couldn't have been more than 23, with haunted eyes and the rigid posture of someone bracing against pain. His left sleeve hung empty, pinned at the shoulder. "Mr. Dawson?" "Just Frank. Have a seat." The young man, his name was Michael Torres, sat down carefully, as if sudden movements might shatter him. He stared at his remaining hand for a long moment before speaking. "I just got back from Vietnam, 3 months ago. I can't sleep, can't eat, can't look at my family without seeing..." His voice broke. "I lost my whole squad, Mr. Dawson. 12 men. I was the only one who made it out." Frank recognized the guilt immediately. It wore the same face in every generation, spoke with the same voice across every war. "Tell me about them," Frank said quietly. And Michael Torres did. For 2 hours, he talked about his squad, their names, their habits, their dreams, the way they'd become brothers in the crucible of combat. He described the ambush that killed them, the chaos and terror and the inexplicable luck that had left him alive when everyone else died. When he finished, his eyes were red but clearer somehow, as if speaking the names aloud had given them weight and dignity beyond the nightmare images. "Does it get easier?" Michael asked. Frank considered the question with the honesty it deserved. "No, but it gets bearable. You learn to carry them with you, not as guilt, but as memory. You honor them by living well, by being someone worthy of the chance they didn't get. How do I do that? One day at a time, one choice at a time. You show up, you do the work, you let people help you." Frank leaned forward. "And when you're ready, you help someone else carry their burden, because that's how we survive, by sharing the weight." Michael Torres left the office that day with a referral to a trauma counselor, a job lead at a construction company whose owner was a Korean War veteran, and something more intangible but perhaps more important: the knowledge that he wasn't alone, that others had walked this path before him and found their way through. 3 years later, Michael Torres would return to the Foundation as a volunteer, offering the same presence Frank had given him. But that's how these things work. Grief transformed into grace, pain alchemized into purpose, the cycle of healing perpetuating itself across generations. In the autumn of 1976, Frank stood in his workshop behind the house he'd built with his own hands, putting the finishing touches on a wooden horse he'd carved for Rosie's 12th birthday. The phone rang inside. He set down his carving knife and walked through the back door into the kitchen, where the avocado green phone still hung on the wall. The same phone that had carried William Carver's urgent warning 4 years earlier. "Dawson," he answered. "Frank, it's Patricia." Her voice carried a warmth that hadn't been there in their first meeting. Over the past 4 years, they'd become something like friends, bound by shared memory and shared mission. "I wanted to let you know, Danny's name is being added to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial design. They're including Korean War casualties, too. He'll be remembered." Frank closed his eyes, feeling the weight of those words settle over him like a benediction. "That's good, Patricia. That's real good. Will you come with me when it's unveiled? To Washington? I'd be honored." After they hung up, Frank stood in his kitchen for a long moment, looking out the window at the Texas landscape he'd called home for most of his life. The golden light of late afternoon painted everything in warm tones. The fields, the fence line, the old barn where he'd taught Rosie to ride horses last summer. He thought about Danny Henderson, about Sergeant Palmer, about Corporal Chen. He thought about the 15 men who'd survived Firebase Delta, scattered now across the country, living lives that might never have been. He thought about William Carver, who'd transformed his guilt into purpose and his privilege into service. He thought about Patricia Henderson, who'd chosen forgiveness over bitterness. And he thought about all the veterans who'd walked through the Foundation's doors over the past 4 years. Broken men and women who'd found their way back to themselves through the simple act of being witnessed, being valued, being told that their service mattered. Some debts could never be fully repaid, but they could be honored, they could be remembered, and they could inspire others to carry forward the work of healing and hope. 5 years after that night at Chateau Laurent, Frank Dawson sat on his front porch watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Rosie sat beside him, 14 now, on the edge of young womanhood, still curious and kind and remarkably wise for her years. She'd been asking him about the war lately, about Firebase Delta, about the choices that had defined his life. "Grandpa," she said quietly, "do you ever wish you'd made different choices that night?" Frank considered the question as seriously as he considered everything his granddaughter asked him. "I wish those 3 men had lived. I wish Danny Henderson had married Patricia and had children and grown old. I wish Sergeant Palmer had gone home to his mother in Ohio. I wish Corporal Chen had opened the restaurant he always talked about." Frank paused. "But I don't wish I'd made a different choice, because the choice I made, hard as it was, saved 15 lives. And those 15 lives mattered just as much as the 3 we lost. Even Mr. Carver, even though he was mean to you, especially Mr. Carver, because look what he's done with the life Danny gave him. Look at all the people the Foundation has helped. Look at how he transformed his guilt into something beautiful." Rosie leaned against her grandfather's shoulder, and they sat together in comfortable silence as the sun sank below the horizon. Inside the house, the phone would ring soon. Another veteran in crisis, another family needing help, another opportunity to transform darkness into light. But for now, in this moment, there was just the sunset and the quiet and the knowledge that some battles are never truly over. But that doesn't mean they're not worth fighting. The Henderson Palmer Chen Foundation still operates today, though Frank Dawson passed away in 1998 at the age of 76. William Carver died 2 years later, leaving his entire fortune to the foundation. Patricia Henderson lived until 2012, serving on the board until her final days. But here's what the official histories don't tell you. On quiet nights in San Antonio, veterans still gather at the Foundation's original building. They say if you listen carefully, you can hear the sound of an old man's voice, patient, gentle, absolute in its conviction, telling broken soldiers that they're not alone, that their service mattered, that the weight they carry can be shared. Some call it memory, some call it legend. But the veterans who've sat in that second-floor office, who've felt the presence of something larger than themselves, who've found healing in those walls, they know the truth. Some men's legacies don't die. They echo forward through time, touching lives they'll never know, transforming pain into purpose across generations. And that, perhaps, is the truest form of immortality any soldier could ask for. If this story moved you, take a moment to honor a veteran in your life, or support an organization helping those who served. Their battles don't end when they come home. Let's make sure they know their service matters. Drop a comment sharing how this story touched you, and subscribe for more incredible true stories of courage, redemption, and the power of second chances.